The following message is a presentation of Ligonier Ministries, home of the radio program Renewing Your Mind with R.C. Sproul.
As we continue now with our study of knowing the will of God, I remind you that in our first session we talked about the importance of the Christians having a sense of vocation with respect to their life work. And I mentioned that that very word, vocation, is rapidly disappearing from our vocabulary, and we think, and when it is used, vocation, we have vocational schools and so on, we just think of a particular career or career path or a place of employment and not think of it in the classical sense of the meaning of the term vocation, which means a calling. And historically, Christians use the term vocation to refer to their sense of having a definite call in their lives to be engaged in some particular occupation. Not simply a calling to the ministry in terms of the formal ordained ministry, but also the calling to what may be called secular occupations. Because behind this thinking was the Christian idea that all of life is sacred and all the things that we do are to be done to the glory of God and for His honor and in His service. And so I'd like to see a renaissance in our own day of this sense of vocation in the Christian life. And I suspect that that's the notion that's stirring around people's minds when they seem to be preoccupied with this question, how can I know the will of God for my life? Because when people ask that question, they may mean where should I live, whom should I marry, and so on. But generally speaking, the most important question that people have in their minds when they ask the question, how do I know the will of God for my life? They're thinking in terms of their life's work. Now, you know that our custom as Americans, when we meet a stranger for the first time, the first thing we ask them is, what is their name? The second thing usually we ask them is, where do they live? And then the third thing we ask them is, what do you do? Now, what does that question mean when we say, what do you do? They say, well, I do lots of things. I go to the drugstore and I go to the hamburger store and buy a hamburger and a milkshake. What do you mean, what do I do? We know what we're asking. We're saying, what is your occupation? What is your life's work? Now, to come at this question of vocation from a biblical perspective, I want to direct our attention today to some things that the Apostle Paul teaches the church in the 12th chapter of Romans, beginning in verse 3. Those of you who were with us recently when we did our study of worship will recall that we looked at the 12th chapter of Romans in the first two verses with respect to Paul's plea for people presenting their bodies as a living sacrifice. So there's a connection here in the sense that our life's work is to be an expression of worship. It is to be an expression of praise, and that we are to offer ourselves as the sacrifice of praise in all that we do. So with that as the background, then Paul says in verse 3, "For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think." Now, the first thing that the apostle indicates here, after calling us to present ourselves holy and acceptable unto God, which is our reasonable service, is that he implores us now not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought. And you may ask yourself, what does that have to do with vocation? Isn't this simply a general injunction for us to be humble? Well, it certainly is a mandate for humility, but it's more than that, as we see in the rest of the statement. I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. Now, what he is saying is that we are engaged here in self-evaluation, and that when we evaluate ourselves, the evaluation or the analysis is to be an analysis that Paul describes as being sober. Not sober as distinct from drunk, but sober in the sense of being calm, reasonable, and not carried away with enthusiasm or fantasy. And the context in which he's speaking here of practical terms is, because what immediately follows is a discussion of the various functions that God has ordained for labor within the church and the use of Christians' gifts. And that is, the general context here has to do with understanding our calling. And so the first thing I infer from this text about discerning our calling before God, learning of our vocation, is that we make a sober evaluation or sober analysis of our gifts, of our talents, and of ourselves. Now, it may be easier for us to get up in a tree stand when we're hunting buck and say, God, if you want me to be a fireman, have a 6-point buck come along. If you want me to be a doctor, have a 4-point buck come along. And if you want me to be a school teacher, have an 8-point buck come along. And if you want me to be a billionaire, don't allow any bucks to come along. That's kind of the way we would like to do it. It's a lot simpler to have God give us a direct line from heaven than to think soberly, as the apostle calls us to do here. And again, to think soberly does not mean that we have an inflated opinion of ourselves. We ought not to think more highly of ourselves than is soberly judged. Now, let me use as an illustration of this the business of being in the ordained clergy. When I sought ordination in my church and had to be examined by the presbytery, I had to be examined not only with respect to theology and all the rest, but before I could even have the examination for ordination, I had to first of all be taken under care of the presbytery, to be under their tutelage, under their government, under their authority and leadership as a student. And in order to go under care of the presbytery, I had to answer this question: do you have any reason to believe, or can you give any evidence that you have been called to the ministry? Now, what the church was asking me at that point was for evidence of what is called an internal call to the ministry, or what could be called a subjective call. That is, that I feel within my own soul, my own mind, a conviction that God had been leading me into the ministry. That's what the presbytery wanted to know. And I answered that question. They were satisfied. They took me under their care. But what did not happen immediately was I was not instantly ordained and assigned to a particular parish to work as a minister. There had to be a whole lot of other things happen before that would take place. First thing, in our denomination is committed historically to an educated clergy. And so before I could qualify for the ministry, I had to go to seminary. And I had to graduate from seminary after 3 years of training there. But even that wasn't enough. Even if I graduate from seminary and make straight A's in seminary, the church will still not automatically ordain me to the ministry. I now have to go through what's called ordination trials, where I have to pass the examination not of the seminary, but of the presbytery. Because all the seminary does is determine whether I know the information in the courses. It doesn't challenge me on whether I believe it. I could maybe be a student in seminary and pass all the exams on what the church believes and without my necessarily embracing it. But the presbytery wants to know, do you believe it? And what are your own personal views? And so I had to go through the trial of ordination in order to be ordained. But I had this problem. When I graduated from seminary, I couldn't even go to presbytery and even ask for an ordination exam because I had something else that was lacking. Does anybody wonder if anyone knows what that is? I wasn't going straight into the church from seminary. I was going on to graduate school. And in order to be ordained in my church, you not only have to have an internal call, but you have to have an external call. You have to have a call from some Christian body, from a college, from a church, or some Christian group that wants you to serve in the ministry where they are and in their institution. And so once I could show evidence of a call, then I could go to the presbytery and go through the examination. And if I pass the examination and have a call, then I can be ordained. Well, now let's back up and review the bidding on all this. All the hoops that I had to jump through in order to become an ordained minister in my denomination. First of all, I had to give evidence of an internal call, a personal, subjective sense that God was leading me into the ministry. Second of all, I had to pass a series of courses of formal education, in this case, seminary. Thirdly, I had to pass the trials and examinations of the presbytery. And fourthly, I had to satisfy the presbytery that I had an outward, objective call that confirmed my own inward inclinations. And there was another thing, too. I also had to take a battery of psychological exams and things of that sort to see if my personality was suitable for being in the ministry. Now, some people react negatively to that, and they say, wait a minute, why should we have to go through all of this? Isn't it the Holy Spirit who ultimately ordains people to the ministry, not human institutions? Well, I think the Scriptures have something to say about that. If you look in the Old Testament, you had charismatic leaders, that is, people who were chosen directly and immediately by God for a special task, who were given a divine and supernatural call to that task, such as the canonical prophets, people like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Hosea and so on. And in addition to those men who had this special calling of God and equipping by the Holy Spirit, being gifted specifically for that task, so also you had your schools of prophets and your regularly ordained priests in the organizational life of the Church of Israel. And so you have what we would call your ordinary offices, and you had your extraordinary offices whereby God directly and immediately endowed people with the gift and sent them into this special task with special authority. The same thing was true with the apostles. Where to be an apostle in the New Testament, you had to be called and equipped directly and immediately by Christ. One of the biggest issues in the early church was the question of the credentials of Paul the apostle. Why was that a question? Well, all the rest of the apostles had been chosen by Christ before he went to heaven. And we know in the book of Acts that after Judas died, they cast lots to see who would be chosen to replace him, and there were certain criteria that were set forth as measuring rods for qualifications for being an apostle. And what were those qualifications? Well, they were basically two or three. The first thing is you had, first of all, to have been a disciple, a student, under the rabbinic teaching of Jesus during his earthly ministry. Secondly, you had to be an eyewitness of the resurrection of Christ. And thirdly, you had to receive a direct call, that is, proof, a vocation, that Christ had called you to be an apostle. Now, do you see why it was an issue with Paul? Because Paul didn't know Jesus during his earthly ministry. He was not a disciple of the earthly Christ. He was not an eyewitness of the resurrection. And he was not called directly to be an apostle by Jesus during Jesus' earthly ministry. And so, in terms of all three qualifications, on the surface, it seemed like Paul was excluded from having any possibility of being considered an apostle. And yet, he became the chief apostle to the Gentiles. Why? Because on the road to Damascus, the risen Christ appeared to him and directly and immediately called Paul to be an apostle and set him aside and consecrated him for that task. So now he had 2 out of the 3 criteria taken care of. He now was a witness of the resurrected Christ. And you remember in 1 Corinthians 15 when Paul rehearses the history of the episodes of Jesus' appearances after the resurrection. And then he said, and lastly, as one born out of due time, he appeared unto me. And that Paul constantly defended his apostolic authority by referring to his call from Christ on the road to Damascus. So that raises the question, well, can't there be apostles today? If you could have an apostle in the first century who didn't meet the criteria of the book of Acts, who were not part of the earthly school of Jesus in terms of the disciples and so on, couldn't somebody just walk into the church today and say, hey, I was walking down the street the other day, and I saw this bright light in heaven, and I heard this voice, and this voice told me to be an apostle, and I'm the new Apostle Paul, and I'm going to write the next edition of the New Testament. Why does the church say no to that? Because even though Paul had the appearance of Christ and the direct call of Christ, what did Christ call him to do? He made him go to Jerusalem and be certified and confirmed by the other apostles whose credentials were never in doubt. And that's the thing that couldn't possibly happen today. Now, I say this for a reason. In the very first century, particularly at Corinth, the church had this problem. The apostles ordained officers in the church and set up a structure of church government where people were to be called out of the congregation and elevated to positions of authority and ministry according to the recognition of their gifts and talents. But then you had people who were troubling the church, particularly at Corinth, who came along and said, wait a minute, the Holy Spirit told me that I'm supposed to have the authority in the church. And you had a group of people claiming to be authorized directly by the Holy Spirit and have a personal inward call, who then came in and usurped the authority of the duly constituted officers of the church. Paul had to deal with that in his lifetime, and even after that, the Bishop of Rome, Clement, had to write another letter to the Corinthian congregation because that problem was still going on, and it plagued the church to no end in the early church, and it still does. And it plagued Israel in the Old Testament, and in a simple, kind of pithy way, to summarize this, we have this statement. Some were sent, and some went. And that still plagues the church today. And when Paul is speaking here about a sober analysis and not thinking too highly of ourselves, or more highly of ourselves than we ought to, that means that I cannot just appear in the church and claim governing authority or leadership authority on the basis of my own subjective impulses. My call to the ministry must be confirmed by the church. But in broad measure, that not only applies to ordained clergy in the church, but it also applies to all of our lives and to all of our vocations, that we should be concerned to seek confirmation of what we perceive to be God's call to and on our lives. I mean, I could walk into the headquarters of the Orlando Magic tomorrow afternoon and tell the general manager, God has told me that I should be the next center of your basketball team, get rid of Shaquille O'Neal, and play me. I think the verse that the manager would say to me is, you ought not to think more highly of yourself here than you are here, because you're just not qualified to play center for the Orlando Magic. But I may dream of doing it, and I may have a desire to do it, and I may fantasize about it, and then confuse my fantasies with the call of God. Well, as our time expires, we're only beginning this evaluation, and we'll look at it more thoroughly in our next session. Do you have a vocation? If I were to meet you and ask you your name and where you lived, and then said to you, what do you do? What would you say? How would you summarize your life's work? And then the next question I would raise is this. Why do you do what you do? Why is this your life's work? How did you come to the conclusion that this is where you should be? Now, I'm not just asking an abstract question here. I talk to people all the time who are miserable in their jobs. And sometimes you get the idea, they just don't fit here. This isn't where they belong at all. Why? How did they get into this line of work in the first place? Were they pushed into it by their parents or by a zealous employer or a coach or something? Have they really taken the trouble to analyze carefully and soberly their gifts and their inclinations and their personality fit with this particular endeavor? I think the Bible gives us great wisdom when they call us to search out our gifts and our talents in a sober way, not mystically and not simply by our own evaluation, but by looking to the community, by looking to the church, by looking to our friends to help us discern our gifts.
For more information about Ligonier Ministries, call 1-800-435-4343 or contact us on the web at ligonier.org. That's ligonier.org. Or write P.O. Box 54, 7500, Orlando, Florida, 32854.